This film is part of a series in which experts talk about the core concepts of educational assessment and tackle some tricky issues. I'm Candace Stepnam, a researcher from the Oxford University Center for Educational Assessment. In this film, we will focus upon university or college admissions, as it's known in the United States. We will look at the purpose of the admissions assessments, how they vary, and what their effects are, and what steps have been taken to produce more equitable entry policies. Selection for college places has a long history. The process of admissions vary across country universities and even across courses within universities. But there are some common themes that we address with the experts here. Our experts in this video are from the US and the UK, so the video focuses on those contexts. In some countries, like the Netherlands, all students have a right to higher education if they have a high school diploma. But in most countries, there is no universal right to this. According to UNESCO figures, approximately 10% of the world's school leavers went on to university in 1971. By 2020, the proportion was 40%, with the highest rates of enrollment reaching almost 80% in Europe and North America. Now, that might lead us to believe that the job of university admissions has changed a lot, because it's no longer necessary to select just the top 10% of school-leaving cohort. Well, some argue that they haven't changed enough. In his 2010 book, College Admissions for the 21st Century, Professor Robert Sternberg of Cornell University argued that admissions tests, as they are today, are historical novelties and look pretty much the same as they did at the beginning of the 20th century. Professor Sternberg's work on intelligence testing is very well known. Here's what he had to say about his experience of working with university admissions when we spoke with him about this.
My first job, or at least my first full-time job, was as a special assistant to the Dean of Undergraduate Admissions at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. This was right after I graduated from Yale, and it was a transitional position before I went to graduate school. And so I was heavily involved in all aspects of admissions at Yale. And because I'm also a researcher, I was studying admissions at other institutions, both selective and non-selective ones. And the kind of mentality that's being used in much of university admissions, at least in the United States, dates back pretty far. And that is, we'll look at academic credentials, things like test scores. In the United States, that would be things like the SAT and the ACT. We'll look at grades in school, and those will be measures of academic proficiency. And for some schools, that's it. I was once provost and senior vice president at Oklahoma State University, which would admit you solely on the basis of your grades and your test scores. And there are many universities that still do that. For more selective universities and others that use holistic admissions, they go beyond just test scores and grades, and they might also look at extracurricular activities. And they might also have teacher recommendations, which mostly reflect grades, or guidance counselor recommendations. In the United States, they'll also look at special extracurricular activities such as athletics, music, things they may need for teams, say, or for an orchestra. And in the United States, many schools still will look at whether your parents are alumni of the university, or whether they're what are called development cases, which translates into, do they have money that they might contribute to the university? But that's exactly what we did when I was an admissions officer way back when.
Professor Sternberg, then, has firsthand experience of the focus on test outcomes as an entrance requirement in a lot of colleges in the States. In some countries, university offers are made solely on the school leaving test scores. You might anticipate this being a good thing. After all, using academic performance scores is a meritocratic approach, right? Well, that might be the aim, but over the decades, it has become apparent that the pattern of test scores by different demographic groups often mirror their advantages and disadvantages in society. In the US, there's been a test optional admissions movement in which some institutions allow applicants to decide whether or not to submit their SAT or ACT test scores. Let's hear from Dr. Rochelle Michel on what has led to this. Dr. Michel is a psychometrician who previously worked at Educational Testing Service in the US. She is now Deputy Executive Program Officer at Smarter Balanced.
Yeah, so that goes back to some of the things in terms of looking at scores across demographic groups and seeing that traditionally some demographic groups just kind of have this particular pattern that we see in terms of performance. And then some universities have done studies, what we would call validity studies, to really look at their entrance information, so their information about their test scores, their entering GPA from high school, and then they'll look at some longer term outcomes. So things like their first year GPA, but then beyond, looking at whether or not they graduate, looking at, are they able to successfully then go on to graduate school or get employment within their field. And so some of the studies were finding that there's a discrepancy between what they were finding in terms of students who may not have performed as well on some of the standardized tests, but still have really good outcomes at their institutions. And so that has also been another factor. I had mentioned COVID as an opportunity for colleges and universities to kind of rethink things during that time, and a number of them just have not gone back after that. So it's a combination of things that are contributing to that. And I think that once a college or university is able to find an alternative way of making admissions decisions, and if they're finding that it works for them, it's going to be really hard for them to now revert back and implement a new additional factor that needs to be considered, that families have to pay for in order to kind of still make those admissions decisions if they were able to effectively do it without that information. But again, that varies because there have been schools that have gone back to um, using the test scores in admissions decisions. They have found value. They find that it is a good piece of information out of the body of information that they use to make decisions. And they find that it does tell them things that may not be apparent in the other pieces of information that they use, because the test scores were meant to be kind of that standardized across the board piece of information that a student can submit that is not, um, you know, that doesn't require something extra in terms of like a letter of recommendation. Like it requires that you have a relationship and that someone can speak to your skills and abilities and the type of person that you are. But you can imagine that could have an impact, because if you're more of a quiet person who hasn't said a lot, but it doesn't necessarily speak to how well you'll do in college or university, that maybe someone can't write as glowing of a recommendation as a student who may be more engaged, more of that conversational type of student who's always asking questions and always volunteering for different things. So, we always say, as we think about admissions and the different components, Each piece has their benefits and their drawbacks. And so that's why we always emphasize that it should be a combination of pieces of information that are used in the admissions decision, because we know this. We know that each one of the elements that we look at, whether it be test scores or essays or activities or letters of recommendation, there's always some aspect that is outside of a student's control or may not fully represent them as a full individual. So,
A counterexample to this is gender. In many countries around the world, as a group, females outperform males in school leaving assessments. But this pattern is neither generated by advantage nor does it translate into advantage. We would need another video to fully explain this, but essentially, this again shows that we are not living in meritocracies. Professor Vicky Bolivar from the University of Durham in England has been studying patterns in university admissions for many years. She explains these differences and why it's important for admission processes to contextualize the results before making admissions decisions.
So my research, most of it has used UCAS data and other big national data sets to look at who applies to university and who gets in. And basically what we found is that young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, when they have the grades that make them eligible to go to university, will apply. And they'll aspire to the most highly selective universities that their grades will permit. They're not always as likely to be offered places, though, as their more privileged peers. That's something that we found held throughout the early 2000s, looking at UCAS data. So they will apply if they have the grades. The big barrier is that they're much less likely to get the grades that are needed. And so they're not even eligible to apply, particularly to the most prestigious and academically selective universities. And one important thing that we did with the research was that we showed what the distribution of prior attainment looks like for free school meal young people, non-free school meal state school pupils, and then privately educated people, so that it was evident that if universities were really only interested in admitting students who had 3 A's or better at A level, that the number of young people from disadvantaged backgrounds who could meet that bar was really vanishingly small, and they'd basically really not be able to widen participation any further if they stuck with that very high bar for those young people. So I think what we did successfully was show that the pool that they were fishing in was really, really small, but more importantly, we were able to persuade the Office for Students and government departments and increasingly universities to rethink what it means to have a certain set of grades at A level or GCSE. So we were able to show, for example, that whilst 3 A's or better at A level is typical for someone educated in a fee-paying private school, the very best students from free school meal backgrounds at state schools, say the top 10% of performers, they've got B's and C's at A level. And what we were able to do was to reframe that and recast that to show that these are the top performing young people under very difficult circumstances. And so we need to contextualize what grades mean if we're going to A, widen participation, and B, properly recognise the ability and the unmet potential that young people from disadvantaged backgrounds have. Essentially capturing and recognising the social backgrounds and the educational circumstances of applicants when trying to make sense of what do these 3 B's at A level mean, how does that applicant compare to someone from a much more privileged background who's got a string of A stars. And really pleasingly, a lot of universities, including to a degree Oxford and Cambridge and many Russell Group universities, have begun to contextualise their admissions processes. And what that's meant is trying to use good metrics of socioeconomic background to work out who has had a tougher time in the education system. And secondly, looking at reducing the standard entry requirement, typically by just 1 or 2 grades, but I think the ambition is to go further and to reduce those grades further, so as to recognise that there's a lot of unmet potential amongst applicants from socioeconomic backgrounds who are not going to meet the really high standard criteria.
Professor Randy Bennett from Educational Testing Service has recently developed some principles for designing more socioculturally responsive assessments. Here he explains how bias in testing can, instead of producing meritocracy, bring about social reproduction.
We know a lot about the fairness of large-scale, high-stakes assessments in particular, but the judgment that one makes depends on how it is one thinks about bias and what it is that one values. So, for example, in the post-secondary admissions context, if bias is defined in terms of such factors as differential prediction and differences in test structure across groups or the incidence of differential item functioning, then one could argue that the evidence suggests that there's little, if any, bias. Any predictive bias, for example, it's typically found tends to disappear when grades are added into the prediction of college performance in terms of grades and persistence to degree. However, that evidence presumes that university grades and persistence to degree themselves are fair criteria, and there are reasons to question that assumption. For example, with respect to students who are minoritized, they tend to come to post-secondary institutions with few role models among the faculty, with limited levels of support in acculturating to what may be, for many of them, a very different environment from the one that they're coming from. They come to institutions that have students and faculty that are culturally different and that are not always very welcoming. They come often with financial challenges that the institution might only be partially meeting, and they often come with responsibilities to family that are very demanding and might distract from their studies, all of which create psychological stresses and other kinds of challenges different from the ones that most majority students may experience, and which may negatively impact both their grades and their persistence to a degree, even though they may be otherwise academically qualified. Moreover, in many courses, grades are determined based on tests that are very similar in their format to the admissions tests that they were judged when they were admitted. That is, measures allowing for expressions of competency that are very particular in their format and in the ways of knowing that they value. So how we validate admissions tests has built into it some of the very same types of unfairness that are arguably present in the tests themselves. Fairness can also be defined in a second way, and that is that tests are cultural artifacts, as are formative assessments, by the way. They privilege competencies, ways of knowing, modes of expression, and linguistic forms that are rooted in a dominant common culture. In the U.S. in 1980, the population was about 80% Caucasian, or 20% or so students of people of color. Today, the population is closer to 59% Caucasian, or 41% or so people of color, a doubling in only 40 years. Today, our public school population is 52%, majority students of color. The tests we use today were not designed for these levels of diversity. The tests we use today were essentially designed in and for an America that no longer exists. Fairness can be defined in yet another way, in terms of the use and the consequences that are associated with that use. Standardized tests in significant part measure opportunity to learn, which is why they're correlated with socioeconomic status and with race ethnicity. We know that opportunity to learn has been unequal for many groups based on race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status for hundreds of years and continues to be so today, in large part because in the U.S. schools are funded by property taxes. So neighborhoods tend to determine the quality of the schools. As a result, the test score reflects the conflation of opportunity to learn with what you've been able to do with the opportunities that you've been given. If that's true, one can reasonably ask whether it's fair to use measures that significantly reflect opportunity to learn in making determinations of whether to give further opportunity to learn. So the questions become ones of whether we value giving further opportunity primarily to only those who have achieved because of the opportunities society has given them, or whether we value giving further opportunity to some of those who have not been so privileged. So the question as to what we know about fairness and what fairness is with respect to standardized tests depends largely on how one thinks about bias and fairness and what it is that one values.
Generally speaking, the focus of discussions of fairness in university admissions testing tend to relate to social class in the UK and to race and ethnicity in the US. In the next series of clips, you will hear from Professor Bolivar about how the Office of Students in the UK has changed how admissions test scores are interpreted in an attempt to address fairness related to social class disadvantage. This has taken a long time to come into policy and practice. In contrast, Professor Michel explains that the U.S. Supreme Court decided in a ruling on 29 June 2023 that race should not be taken into account in college admissions in the U.S. The judgment was that affirmative action, by taking race into account, violated the 1964 Civil Rights Act. President Biden spoke out against the court ruling, saying it must not be the last word on affirmative action.
Well, throughout most of the 90s and early 2000s, it was maintained by policymakers, government, universities that the main barrier to access to higher education for underrepresented groups was a lack of aspiration and ambition. And many, many millions of pounds were spent every year by universities, lots of outreach work determined to introduce young people from disadvantaged backgrounds to the idea of university, to encourage them to aspire to go. And I think it took a really long time to realise that a lot of that money was misplaced and a lot of that activity was misplaced, because it wasn't really the case that these young people didn't know about university, weren't interested in going. Turns out that the biggest barrier to them is being able to achieve the grades that are required to be eligible for admission. And although that was known, that was seen as a kind of a deficit on the part of young people often. And so universities were looking for the ones who could get those grades and encourage them to aspire to apply to university. But the bigger issue really is that disadvantaged young people who are bright and highly motivated, have high aspirations, they just don't have the same levels of economic capital, cultural capital, social connections to enable them to get the really high grades that many universities ask for. 3 A stars is a really high ask for someone from free school meals, eligible family, low-income family in a deprived neighbourhood. So I think pre-university attainment has been recognised more recently as the biggest barrier.
Sure. So, in short, as we think about the recent Supreme Court case, which was really at the heart of it, questioning how or if race should be factored into admissions decisions. And so the judgment was that race, ethnicity, should not be a factor in the admissions decisions. Um, so that has really caused some changes across the board. So in terms of a number of things that contribute to what is provided. So whether that be the college application, college and universities were required to make some changes to their applications, removing questions that were explicitly asking about race and ethnicity. And I say explicitly because at the heart of it, what a college or university is trying to do is they're really trying to see how they can make sure that they have a diverse group of students and create a diverse body in terms of their college and university, and have a set of experiences where students are really getting to understand other students beyond students like themselves, and have that experience, have that understanding of different people from different backgrounds, different cultures, different parts of the country. And so what some colleges and universities have done is to ask about students' experiences and how those experiences will contribute to the diversity of the college and university. So it allows a student to talk about their background, whatever that background may be. So it may be that they do write about or talk about their experiences as coming from a particular race or ethnic background, but it could also be in terms of thinking about organizations that they've participated in, community service activities that they've engaged in. You know, it just allows them to talk more broadly about their experience. So, I think given the recency of the judgment, again, this is another area where there really hasn't been sufficient time to uh, have data talking about the implications of this judgment, but it will be interesting to hear more from colleges and universities about how do they still achieve their goals of having a diverse body of students without those explicit pieces of information about some of the demographics of their applicants.
We have heard in this film Professor Sternberg's view that the approach to admissions testing has not changed for a century, and he argues for a character-based and problem-solving approach to admissions testing. Professor Michel explains how admissions testing is conducted in the U.S., how varied it is, and how the recent Supreme Court ruling will affect admissions. Professor Bennett indicated that biases are built into the design of tests, which is why we get outcomes that reproduce the patterns of social advantage we see in society. And Professor Bolivar explained those patterns in the UK and how policy has changed to take into account the context in which students' scores are produced. We hope you have found this video interesting. If you're interested in watching more of our films, you can find them on our website at the Oxford University Center for Educational Assessment. The link is here. We hope you find them helpful.